Our speaker today, Gregory A. Smith. He is Associate Director of Research with the Pew Foundation. And he is based close to Washington, D.C., and came to us at the invitation of the Southern Baptist Research Fellowship. There, he's participating in that meeting with some of his information as well. He helps to coordinate the center's domestic polling on religion. Smith also writes reports and provides information to news media and others about religion and public opinion, religion and American politics, and the political views of Catholics. Smith holds a doctorate in government from the University of Virginia, where he was a fellow at the Center on Religion and Democracy. He's an author of the 2007 and 2014 U.S. Religious Landscape Studies, the 2010 U.S. Religious Knowledge Survey, the 2007 and 2011 Pew Research Center surveys of Muslim Americans, the 2012 Mormons in America report, and the 2012 Nuns on the Rise. He also wrote Politics in the Parish, the Political Influence of Catholic Priests. He has been interviewed as an analyst by a variety of broadcast media, including ABC, CBS, and many, many others. So we are blessed and honored that you're here. Dr. Smith, please come and bring that information to us. He will have a presentation, and then he will have some time for us to ask questions to him. Let's welcome Dr. Smith with us.
Well, good morning. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm grateful for the chance to be with you and to share with you some of the findings of our 2014 Religious Landscape Study. The study helps to document some of the really key, I think profound changes that are underway in the American religious landscape. It shows that the United States is becoming gradually and modestly, but nevertheless noticeably less religious. Perhaps most importantly, you see this in the growing share of Americans who say that they have no particular religious identity. So there are big changes underway, but that's only part of the story. At the same time, it's also the case that the United States remains a nation of believers, where most people do identify with a religion. And that group is about as religiously observant today as it has been at any point in the recent past. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of the details of this study with you and to trying to answer any questions or respond to any feedback or comments that you might have. Before I get into the data, however, I do want to say just a few words about the Pew Research Center, about who we are and what we do. We are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy fact tank. We call ourselves a fact tank to distinguish ourselves from the think tank, that other organization that's so common in Washington, D.C., where I'm from. We do not take positions on any political issues. We also don't take positions on any religious issues. Our name, the Pew Research Center, some people think that it refers to a church pew, but it actually doesn't. It's a family name. We are a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trust, which was established by the Pew family. And we do a lot of different kinds of research about all kinds of things, about politics, about demographics. We do international polling on all kinds of issues. And I specialize in our research about religion in the United States. We're a nonprofit organization. We don't sell anything. It's not possible to commission us to do a survey or a poll or a research project. We don't charge anyone to access our data or our reports. All of our research is freely available at our website, including everything that I'll talk about today, which is pewresearch.org. Now, I mentioned that the data that we'll focus on today come from our 2014 Religious Landscape Study. This was a massive national survey conducted in all 50 states and the District of Columbia among more than 35,000 adults in the summer of 2014. The study was conducted in both English and in Spanish, on landlines and on cell phones. And the survey's very large sample size means that it has a very small margin of error associated with it. That is to say, it's capable of picking up on even pretty small trends in religion. This is the second time that we've conducted this study. We first did this kind of study in 2007. And so what that means is that we now have the opportunity to see how things have changed over that period of time. So what do the data show? Well, they show that there are some very significant changes underway in the religious composition of the American public. To get at this topic, to get at the religious composition of the public, we ask people what I think is a pretty straightforward question. What is your present religion, if any? Are you Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, Orthodox, such as Greek or Russian Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, agnostic, something else, or nothing in particular? Now, in response to that question, we are now finding that about 23% of adults in the United States are religiously unaffiliated. That is to say, they describe themselves as either atheist or agnostic, or as just nothing in particular when it comes to religion. We sometimes call this group, refer to this group as the religious nones. That's N-O-N-E-S, which is very important. They're very different than the other kind of nuns I'm sure you've all heard about. So 23% of U.S. adults are religious nones. That's up 7 points in just the 7 years since we first did this study. So the religious nones are growing very rapidly as a share of the U.S. population. Over that same period of time, we have seen a decline in the share of Americans who identify themselves as Christians. From about 77 or 78% when we first did the study in 2007, down to about 70% today. And those declines within American Christianity are most pronounced among Catholics, who now account for about 21% of all American adults, down from 24% just 7 years ago or 7 years before we did this study. And we also see declines in the share of the population who identify with mainline Protestantism. Mainline Protestants now account for about 15% of the U.S. population, down from 18% just a few short years ago. You might be interested to see that the share of American adults who identify with evangelical Christianity is really, by comparison, quite stable. Maybe there's been a modest downturn in the share of American adults who identify as evangelicals, but that number, by comparison with Catholics and mainline Protestants, is really quite stable. Now, some people have wondered, what should we make of this change? What should we make of these trends? How should we interpret them? How should we understand them? Does the growth of the nones mean that the United States is becoming less religious? And I would say, not necessarily. In fact, most religious nones are believers. Most of them tell us that they believe in God. About 3 in 10 religious nuns say that religion is at least somewhat important in their lives. 1 in 5 religious nuns even tell us that they pray every day. So it's not the case that the nuns are uniformly secular. But it is true that they are far, far less religious than those people who do identify with a religion. And you can see that here. I mentioned that most nuns say they believe in God. That's true. About 6 in 10 say that they do. But you can also see that that's a far lower rate of belief in God as compared with those who identify with a religion, which in the United States means primarily Christianity. Religious nuns are 36 points less likely than those who identify with a religion to say they believe in God. They are also far, far less likely than those who identify with a religion to say that they pray every day, to say that religion is a very important part of their lives, and very few of them ever attend religious services with any kind of regularity. So religious nuns, they're not all non-believers, but they are far less religious than those who identify with a religion. Furthermore, even as the religious nuns have grown in the United States, they've actually become less religious over time. And you can see that here. This whole slide is based on those who say they have no religion. And what it shows is that today, or in 2014 when we did this study, 2/3 of nuns said that religion was not too or not at all important in their lives. That's up what is that? 8 points in just 7 years. 6 in 10 nuns say that they seldom or never pray. That's up 6 points since we first did this study. I mentioned that few religious nuns attend religious services with any regularity, and they really never have, at least as far back as we've been able to tell. And while it's true that most religious nuns believe in God, say they believe in God, it's also true that the share of religious nuns who say they don't believe in God, that they have no belief in any higher power of any kind, is growing very rapidly. Today, 1/3 of religious nuns say that they do not believe in God. Now, as a result of these twin trends, the growth of the nuns combined with their increasing secularism, as a result of these twin trends, we are beginning to see that the United States population as a whole appears to be growing somewhat less religious. And you see that here. This slide is based on all U.S. adults, including both the religious nuns as well as those who identify with a religion. And you can see here that without any question, the United States remains a nation of believers, and that's an important point to keep in mind. And that makes the United States quite different than much of the rest of the Western world. The United States remains a nation of believers, no question about it. But the share of American adults who say they believe in God has ticked down 3 points in recent years. Similarly, we see a 3-point decline in the share of Americans who say that they pray every day. We see a 3-point decline in the share of Americans who say that religion is very important in their lives. And we've seen a 4-point decline in recent years in the share of Americans who say they attend religious services at least a few times a month. Now, these are all modest changes. I do not want to overstate or exaggerate the degree of this change. This is modest change. However, the fact that we're seeing this kind of change, 3 or 4 points, across all of these key measures of religious belief and practice over a relatively short period of time, that's very striking to me. That suggests to me that these changes, though modest, are real and may reflect that the United States is becoming modestly, but nevertheless noticeably less religious. So these changes, the growth of the nuns and their increasing secularism, really are quite consequential for religion in the United States, serving to pull down on the nation's overall rates of religious observance. So what's behind the growth of the nuns? What's driving these trends? What's causing this? Here, there's a lot of things we could point to. I'm anxious to hear some of your ideas about this. But I want to highlight one key factor here that really cannot be overlooked and cannot be overstated, and that is generational replacement. Basically, what you have happening in the United States is you have older generations of Americans, people from the silent generation, baby boomers, who are really quite religious. Those folks, older Americans, are beginning to pass away. And as they do, they are being replaced by a new generation of young American adults who are simply far less religious than their parents and their grandparents. And you can see that here. Among people from the silent generation, which is people basically born before or during World War II, 85% of them describe themselves as Christians, and just 11% say they are religious nuns. And even among baby boomers, almost 8 in 10 describe themselves as Christians, just 17% are religious nuns. But look at millennials. Only slightly more than half of millennial adults in the United States describe themselves as Christians. And more than 1/3 of them describe themselves as religious nuns. We see the same kind of generational pattern when we look at religious beliefs and practices. 2/3 of people in the silent generation and 6 in 10 baby boomers say that religion is very important in their lives and that they pray every day. But only 4 in 10 millennials say the same. And whereas half of people from the silent generation and 4 in 10 baby boomers say they attend religious services at least once a week, only 1/4 of millennials say that. In fact, most of the millennials that we've talked to tell us that they attend religious services a few times a year at most. So these folks really are almost completely disconnected from organized religion. So there are obviously a number of important changes underway in the American religious landscape. The religious composition of the country is changing very rapidly, with dramatic growth of the nuns driven in large part by generational replacement. But that is only part of the story. It's a key part of the story, but it's only part of the story. It is also true, as I've mentioned and as we have to remember, that the United States remains a nation of believers. It's a nation where, despite the growth of the nuns, 3/4 of the population do identify with a religion. And that group, very importantly, is as religiously observant today as it has been at any time in the recent past. And we see that here. This might seem obvious, but the trend is nevertheless striking. Among people who say they are religiously affiliated, which is mostly Christians, almost everybody says they believe in God, 97%. And that's changed not at all since we first did this study. Among those who identify with a religion, 2/3 say that they pray every day and that religion is very important to them, also very steady since we first did the study in 2007. And 6 in 10 religious nuns say that they attend religious services at least once or twice a month, which is also very steady compared with when we first did this study. In fact, in some important ways, those who identify with a religion may be becoming even more religiously observant than they were in 2007. 43% of religiously affiliated American adults say that they read Scripture at least once a week. That's up 3 points since we first did the study. 30% say they participate in prayer groups or Scripture study groups or other small groups on a regular basis, also up 3 points in recent years. And I find this number especially striking. 26% of religiously affiliated adults say that they share their faith with others at least weekly. That's a high number. That's a big number in my view. And it's up 3 points in recent years. Now, it's before lunch, so I'm going to take the chance of walking you through a little bit of math and hope that I don't lose anybody here. But this is really striking. This is one of my favorite things to look at. One way, so we've seen that the religiously affiliated folks are about as observant as they have been in the recent past. So there's a lot of stability in American religion. And one way to illustrate that stability is to shift from looking at percentages to looking instead at raw numbers. So I'm going to try this. Stay with me here. In 2007, there were 227 million adults in the United States. That's not our figure. That comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. 227 million adults, 83% of whom identified with a religion, mainly Christianity. That means that there were 189 million religiously affiliated adults in the United States, 2/3 of whom said that religion was very important in their lives. If you do the math, multiply that 2/3 by 189 million adults, you get an estimate that in 2007, there were 122 million American adults who identified with a religion and who said furthermore that religion is very important in their lives. This group of people is highly religiously observant by any indication, by any measure, okay? So what's changed? Well, by 2014, there are a lot more adults in the United States, 245 million. A smaller share of them identify with a religion, about 3/4. If we do the math, that means that there are about 187 million religiously affiliated adults as of 2014, 2/3 of whom say religion is very important in their lives. That means that there are now, or at least as of 2014, there were 123 million adults in the United States who identified with the religion and said religion is very important to me. So the number of highly religious adults in the United States has changed not at all. And if anything, maybe it's even ticking upward, although this difference is probably within the survey's margin of error. So the number of highly religious people in the United States has not changed at all. Well, what has changed? How can the share of highly religious people be declining if the number of highly religious people isn't changing at all? Well, the answer is, the reason is that we've now got far more people at the other end of the spectrum. I'm not going to walk through all this math again, but suffice it to say that in 2007, there were 21 million nuns in the United States who said religion is not at all important in my life. This group is really not religious in any meaningful way, okay? 21 million of them in 2007. By 2014, there were 36 million of those folks. So in those 7 years, there was an increase of 15 million people in the United States who said, I don't identify with any religion, and furthermore, religion really doesn't matter to me in my life. So this group, people who are not religious in any sense, is growing very rapidly. And this is how you can have change in the proportion of a population that's religious or not religious, even if the number of people who are highly religious isn't changing at all. I think this is an important point to remember, because sometimes when we think about religious change, we think that the religious change we're seeing in the population reflects changes that individuals are making in their own lives, and that's not the case. It's not the case that people who were in their mid-30s in 2007 and pretty religious have all of a sudden left the church when we interviewed them again 7 years later. That's not what's happening. What's happening is an older generation of American adults who is highly religious is passing away, and they're being replaced by a new generation of young people who are just less religious. Okay? That's an important point to remember, not just when it comes to religion, but also when it comes to when you read about or think about or talk about any other kind of social change in the United States or any other population. Social change doesn't necessarily reflect change among individuals. You can have change in a society even if the individuals who make up that society aren't changing very much at all. So, we've seen a lot about what's changed in American religion. We've talked about some of the big overarching changes that are taking place. The United States does, in fact, appear to be growing modestly but noticeably less religious. At the same time, there's also a lot of stability in American religion. There's a lot more of interest in these data, and one of the things that I find most interesting is that even as the United States is becoming a little bit less religious, we see some indications that there are certain forms of spirituality that are actually on the rise. For example, the share of U.S. adults who say that they regularly feel a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being has grown 7 points in just the last 7 years. And we've seen a similar 7-point increase in the share of Americans who say they regularly feel a deep sense of wonder about the universe. The data show, furthermore, that these forms of spirituality are not a substitute, they're not a replacement for more traditional forms of religious observance. In fact, when it comes to feeling a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being, that's more likely to happen among people who identify with a religion than among people who don't. And in any case, we see these increases in spirituality both among religious nuns and among those who identify with a religion. The data also show, and I think you'll find this interesting as future religious leaders, the data also show that religious institutions in the United States are widely viewed as an important force for social good. And here's what I mean by that. 9 in 10 American adults say that they think churches and other religious organizations bring people together and help strengthen community bonds. 9 in 10 Americans say they think religious institutions play an important role in helping the poor and needy. And 3/4 of Americans say that religious institutions help to protect and strengthen morality in society. One thing that I'm really struck by is that these positive impressions of religious institutions are seen even among people who aren't religious. Even people who don't identify with any religion largely think that religious institutions play these important roles in society. At the same time, many Americans express certain kinds of reservations about religious institutions, and we see that here. About half of American adults say that they think religious institutions are too concerned with money and power. half of Americans think that religious institutions focus too much on rules. And half of the public says they think religious institutions are too involved with politics. And here you can see that these negative views of religious institutions are especially pronounced among people who don't identify with any faith. This is where the reservations that nuns have about religious organizations come into play. Now, if we put these numbers together, we can put these numbers together to get an overall sense of whether or not people have a positive, a negative, or a mixed view of religious institutions. And when we do that, what we see is that about 4 in 10 American adults have a generally positive view of religious organizations. That is to say, they agreed with 2 or 3 of those positive statements and only agreed with 0 or 1 of the negative statements, okay? 4 in 10 Americans have a positive view of religious institutions, about half have a mixed view, and only 7% of American adults have a consistently negative view of religious institutions. I was very struck by that. Even with the growth of the nuns, there are relatively few people who have a consistently negative view of religious organizations. In fact, if you look at the nuns down here, they are as likely to express a generally positive view of religious institutions as they are to express a negative view, with many of them, most of them in fact, expressing a mixed view. One of the other really interesting elements of this project is that it's designed not just to provide a picture of the nation as a whole, but also to be able to speak to and describe the characteristics of every state. We interviewed at least 300 people in every state, and of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And for our presentation today, I pulled together some of the data that we have on Texas. What's happening in Texas? Well, many of the trends that we see at the national level are also evident here in Texas. 18% of Texans now describe themselves as religious nuns. That's lower than among the public as a whole, but they're growing at about the same rate as among the total U.S. population. Evangelicals constitute the largest single religious tradition in Texas at 31%. And we see that the share of Texans who identify as Catholic or as mainline Protestant is ticking down just as it is in the population as a whole. Similarly, we see that many of the trends in religious beliefs and practices that we see in the nation as a whole are also evident in Texas. Now, Texans are more religious on average than are Americans outside of Texas. Amen. But the trends are in the same direction. We see a 3-point decline in the share of Texans who say they believe in God, and similar slight declines, but noticeable declines nevertheless, in the share who say religion is important to them, that they pray regularly, and that they attend religious services at least monthly. We can also use these data, because of the large sample size, to talk not just about the large religious traditions, not just about evangelicals and mainline Protestants and Catholics, but we can also actually take a look at specific denominations. And here, for this presentation, I pulled some of our data on the Southern Baptist Convention. I know that the BUA is associated with the Baptist, say it for me, the Baptist Convention of Texas. We don't have enough interviews with people who identify themselves that way to pull their data, but we do have data on the Southern Baptist Convention. And here's what we see. Evangelicalism as a whole is holding relatively steady in terms of the share of Americans who identify with evangelical denominations, but we have seen a little bit of a decline in the share of Americans who identify themselves as Southern Baptists. Now, I should stipulate, especially for folks here with the Southern Baptist Research Fellowship, that these are different than denominational membership statistics. These numbers do not indicate, when we ask people what their religious identity is, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a formal registered member of a particular church or of that denomination. You can have people who identify as Southern Baptists even if they're not officially a member, and vice versa. You can have people who are on the rolls of the Southern Baptist Convention or of some other denomination, but who don't identify as such. So these numbers are based on self-identification. but nevertheless, I think they're interesting. A slight decline in the share of Americans who identify as Southern Baptists. We can also see here a bit of a demographic profile of Southern Baptists and how they relate to the country as a whole. And here I draw your attention to a couple of numbers. Number one is that the Southern Baptist Convention on average is older than the public as a whole. The median age of Southern Baptist adults, this doesn't include children, but the median age of Southern Baptist adults is 54, compared with 46 for the country as a whole. The Southern Baptist Convention is overwhelmingly white. 85% of self-identified Southern Baptists are white. That compares to 66% of the public as a whole. One number that jumped out at me and that frankly surprised me as I was getting ready for this presentation is that we're not seeing much of an increase at all in the share of self-identified Southern Baptists who are Hispanic. Just 3% of self-identified Southern Baptists in our 2014 study were Hispanic, which is virtually unchanged since 2007. That said, I know that there are many Hispanics here, and I wanted to pull some of our data on Hispanics and conclude with that. And what we see here, if we look at what's happening within the Latino community in the United States, is once again that many of the national trends are reflected here. First of all, we're seeing a very sharp decline in the share of Latinos who identify as Catholic. Now, this number, I suspect, is probably a little bit low. I think the share of Hispanics who are Catholic is probably a little bit higher than that. I say that because this survey, even though it was conducted in both English and Spanish, is not as good at reaching the Latino community as are other surveys that are done with staff of interviewers who are fully bilingual. If you do a survey and use interviewers who are all bilingual, then the share of Hispanics who are Catholic gets a little higher. Nevertheless, no matter how you measure it, and whatever the current state is, there's no question that the share of Latinos who are Catholic in the United States is declining quite rapidly. In fact, we may soon reach a point, and I don't have a way of predicting when this might be, but not too far in the future, we could reach a point where most Catholics in the United States are Hispanic, even though most Hispanics in the United States are not Catholic, which would be a huge development in the course of American religion. So I draw your attention to that just as something to keep an eye on moving forward. We also see that while the Catholic share of the Latino community is declining, we're seeing growth in the share of Latinos who identify as religious nuns, just like we see among the population as a whole, and in the share of Latinos who identify with evangelical Protestant denominations. In fact, we now find that about 1 in 5 Latinos in the United States identify with evangelical Protestant denominations, and that's up significantly in recent years. What's the profile of Latinos who identify as evangelicals? I found some of these comparisons quite interesting. So this chart looks at evangelicals, all evangelicals, including Southern Baptists and people from many other denominations, and just compares some of their demographic characteristics. And what we see here are that Latino evangelicals are much younger than other evangelicals. The median age for Latino evangelicals is 40, compared with 50 for non-Hispanic evangelicals. We also see, this won't come as a surprise, that Latino evangelicals are concentrated in the South and in the West, even more so than among non-Latino evangelicals. We also see here that Latino evangelicals on average have lower levels of educational attainment than other evangelicals. So there's a big educational and socioeconomic disparity here that might not come as a surprise, but that I wanted to share nevertheless. And then finally, I wanted to show this slide. You might wonder, well, if the Latino share of Southern Baptists isn't growing, but the share of Latinos who are evangelical is growing, well, then where are these Latino evangelicals going? If they're not becoming Baptists, where are they going? Well, the answer, by and large, is to Pentecostal denominations. More than 1/3 of all Latino evangelicals in our survey identify with Pentecostal denominations, and another 1 in 5 identify with non-denominational evangelical Protestant churches. 16% of Latino evangelicals identify as Baptists. That's much lower than we see among non-Hispanic evangelicals. I'm going to stop there. We've really just scratched the surface of what we've got in these data. This is really a 30,000-foot view, but I hope it has given a general overview, a broad overview, both of the big changes that are occurring in American politics, but also of some of the some more interesting details. We are seeing that the United States is becoming modestly but noticeably less religious. There's been very rapid growth of the nuns, and that's very important for understanding what's happening in American religion. At the same time, that's only part of the story. At the same time that there's a lot of change in American religion, there's also a lot of stability. The United States remains a nation of believers, and those people who do identify with a religion, who are the big majority of American adults, are as religiously observant, as religiously committed, as religiously serious today as they have been at any point in the recent past. I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to trying to answer any questions that you might have, respond to any feedback. I'd appreciate any comments, and look forward to our discussion. Questions? Yeah?
Have you all measured immigration and impact on the religious landscape?
Yes, we have. Immigration has had a tremendous impact on the religious composition of American society. And I say that in a few ways. Number one, immigration has helped to reinforce the Christian character of the United States. The decline in the Christian share of the population and the growth of the nuns would be much more dramatic if there had been no immigration to the United States. If we were to look only at the native-born population, we'd see a very different picture. The other thing that immigration has done is it's had a really huge impact on Catholicism in the United States. One of the things that these data are able to tell us about in some detail is religious switching, okay? And what they show is that religious switching, people who changing religions, it's very, very common in the United States. More than 4 in 10 American adults today identify with a religion or with no religion that's different than the religion in which they were raised, okay? So religious switching is very common, that's number one. The group that loses more members through religious switching by a huge margin is Catholicism. There's so many interesting, I'm Catholic by background, and so I'm very familiar with these numbers, and every time I think about them and talk about them, they strike me anew. 13% of American adults are former Catholics. 13%, if you just walk down the street, 13%, more than 1 in 10 people that you come in contact with, depending on where you are, is a former Catholic. That's a huge number. I mean, that means that there are more than twice as many former Catholics in the United States as there are Southern Baptists. It's a huge group of people. There are 6 former Catholics for every 1 convert to Catholicism. They lose 6 people for every 1 person they gain. There is no other religion that has anything like that ratio of people leaving to people joining, okay? So Catholicism loses a lot of people through religious switching. Now, if you look back over decades of polling, the Catholic share of the population has actually been quite stable. It's beginning to tick down in recent years, but if you look back over 30, 40, 50 years, the share of Americans who identify themselves as Catholic has been quite steady at about 24, 25%. This begs a question. If the Catholic share of the population is absolutely stable, yet the Catholic Church loses more people through religious switching by a huge margin than any other group, how do these two things come together? The answer? Immigration. If it were not, the Catholic population in the United States has been reinforced over the last three or four decades by immigration from Latin America that has just changed the face of Catholicism in the United States and has helped to offset the losses that the church experiences through religious switching. So immigration is having a huge impact on religion in the United States. It's also serving to reinforce, beyond Christianity, beyond Catholicism, it's just helping to reinforce the religious character of the country. Most immigrants to the United States are quite religious. The United States as a whole would be a far less religious place were it not for immigrants. Other questions? Yes?
It seemed like at 9/11 there was an uptick in church attendance.
Yes.
At 9/11, and then there was a slowly graduation away from that.
Yep.
As the confusion about war and Islam and we're not against Islam and that, and a lot of people pulled away from church because there was this anti-religious thing. Did that have any effect on what we're seeing with the rise of nuns?
I don't think it has any effect on the rise of the nuns. You are absolutely correct that every source of data I've looked at suggests that there was a very sharp spike in church attendance immediately following 9/11. But everything I've seen suggests that it came down just as quickly. It was kind of an immediate reaction. People turned to the church for comfort, but those who weren't churchgoers didn't necessarily stay. I don't think that it had much to do with the growth of the nuns, and I say that because the growth of the nuns, the beginning of the growth of the nuns predated 9/11 by at least a decade. If you look back over, we don't have data at the Pew Research Center that goes back this far, but there's lots of other good sources of information about religion out there. And if you look back at data going back 3 and 4 decades, what you see is that in the 70s and 80s, right up through the early 1990s, the share of Americans who said they had no religion was very small and very steady, and it hovered right around 6, 7, 8% of the population. It was in the early 1990s that the share of Americans who say they have no religion began to increase very noticeably, and that growth has basically continued in a linear fashion since then. So it predated 9/11 and continued on right from there. So, it's impossible to say for sure what the counterfactual might have been. If 9/11 hadn't happened, would the trend have stabilized? There's no way to know that. But because the growth of the nuns predated 9/11, I'd be inclined to think it didn't have too much to do with it. Good question, though. Yes?
You mentioned that the nuns are particularly prevalent among the millennials.
Yes.
But beyond age, what are some other characteristics of the nuns?
Yes, good question. One of the big ones, well, there's a couple that jump out. One is that they're more male than female. Women, especially in Christian countries, tend to be much more religious than men. And in fact, there are a lot of religious groups that are composed of more women than men. The nuns are the opposite. Nuns are composed of more men than women. And that's particularly true of the least religious among them, atheists and agnostics. So nuns are more likely to be men than women. They are more likely to be white as compared with those who identify with a religion. And very importantly, I think, they are very, very socially and politically liberal. Very liberal. In fact, there are a lot of scholars who think that politics is part of what's helped to drive the growth of the nuns. The idea is that there are many people in the United States who are not politically conservative, who are especially don't hold conservative views on topics like homosexuality. And the thinking goes, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, that as religion became associated in the popular imagination, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's true of any particular religious group or not, religion has become associated in the popular imagination with right-wing politics, especially as relates to homosexuality. And in turn, what you've had happen is a lot of people, especially young people, who do not share those politics, who have said, if that's what being religious means, if being religious means being politically conservative, especially on things like homosexuality, then I guess I'm not religious. I don't know if that can explain all of the change. There are some counterintuitive things about the trends that that make me have some questions about that. But there is no question that the religious nuns are very politically liberal. In fact, I'm a political scientist by training, so I get kind of excited about this, especially in an election year. But in fact, if you think about religion and politics in the United States, we often think about, and the group that's often discussed is conservative Christians, right? Evangelicals. And are evangelicals going to support Trump? Are evangelicals going to support the Republican Party at the same rate that they have in the past? What is the Christian right going to do this year? That's what we think about when we think about and talk about and read about religion and politics. But in fact, the religious nuns are very much the political counterweight to white evangelical Protestants on the right. The religious nuns vote almost as strongly Democratic in presidential elections, for example, as white evangelical Protestants vote Republican. And that's a story that sometimes gets lost sight of in discussions of religion and politics. So those are some other kind of defining characteristics of religious nuns. Yes?
Where do our interests overlap with the nuns? Where are some common grounds that we can come together?
Yeah. Well, I think probably the number one thing is that to know about the nuns and where evangelicals and Baptists and other religious folks might have in common is to understand that most religious nuns are not hostile in any way to religion. And that sometimes gets lost sight of. Sometimes when you read accounts of the growth of the nuns, the accounts can almost be a caricature. And I've read media accounts that say the number of non-believers in the United States is growing very rapidly. A quarter of the population is now atheists. Not true. Most religious nuns, in fact, I mentioned that they're composed of people who identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Most of them are nothing in particular. Only about 30% of nuns identify as atheist or agnostic. The much bigger share are those who say, I'm just nothing in particular. They're not connected to religion, but they don't have anything against religious institutions either. There's no hostility there. And as religious leaders, I think that's probably the number one thing to know about the group that you're dealing with. They're not in your pews. They're not seeking you out. We've asked them that question. We've asked the nothing in particulars. Would you say you're just looking for a religion that would be right for you? Absolutely not. 9 in 10 of them say absolutely not. Most of them tell us that they don't feel any need to be part of a community of people of shared beliefs and values. They're totally disconnected from religious institutions, and they tell us that they don't feel like they're missing anything by virtue of that disconnect. But there's also no hostility there. And if there were, a way to appeal, or if they were to come to feel that they were missing something, or that there were something to be gained by involvement in such organizations, I think that might be where the opening is. Does that make sense? Yes?
Millennials are not getting married like other generations did.
Yeah.
Do you think that's having any impact on their religious affiliation?
Yes. Great question. And maybe I'll expand it just a little bit. A lot of people wonder, isn't part of what we're seeing here just what we always see among young people? Young people tend to be less religious than older people, but they'll become more religious as they get older. As they settle down and get married and have families and begin careers, won't they come back, so to speak? And that's a very complicated question. There are a lot of data that suggest that people do become more religious as they get older in certain ways. Probably the best example is people tend to become more prayerful as they get older. But people do not tend to become any more likely to identify with a religion as they get older. And that makes me think that declining marriage rates and the fact that people put marriage off today in a way that wasn't once the case is not what's behind the growth of the nuns. And here's why I say that. This chart is one of my favorite charts. It shows the share of people who are religious nuns by generation over time. And what you can see here is that 29% of millennials today are religious nuns. This is a little different than the data we talked about earlier because it comes from a different source and it's aggregated data. 29% of millennials are nuns. 21% of Generation Xers are nuns. 15% of baby boomers are nuns today. So young people today are less religious than their elders. But notice a couple of other things. When generations come of age, they come of age with lower levels of attachment to religion than the generations that preceded them. So when baby boomers were just entering adulthood in the late 70s, 13% of them were religious nuns. When Generation Xers entered adulthood in the late 90s, 20% were religious nuns. When millennials entered adulthood in the late aughts, 26% of them were religious nuns. So it's not just that millennials are less religious than their parents, it's that they're less religious than their parents and their grandparents ever were, even when they were young adults. Furthermore, this chart shows you that there's no indication, these lines are absolutely flat. There's no indication if people became more likely to identify with the religion as they got older, then these lines should be sloping downward, and they're not. When baby boomers just entered adulthood in the late 70s, 13% were religious nuns. Today, now that they're entering retirement, 15% are religious nuns. No change whatsoever. When Generation Xers entered adulthood in the late 90s, 20% were religious nuns. Today, now that they're in their 30s and 40s and presumably have begun their families and gotten married and settled down, 21% were religious nuns. So people do become more religious as they get older, but I think it would be a mistake to assume that they'll come back to religious organizations or that they'll pick back up with their religious identity. Other questions? I don't have a watch, so if I run over time, please. So maybe one more question? All right.
Two-part
Yes.
question. Interesting trend in the data here. I'm very concerned about millennials and post-millennials. Have you all considered doing a follow-up survey specifically targeted towards the millennials that you can come up with and identify some factors, leading factors that are the result of their affiliation in a religious context? And then second question, understanding there's legal issues and parental consent and issues around cognitive and emotional development with
Right.
post-millennials, have you all considered
Oh, man.
doing a survey targeting that?
Oh, yes. Oh, we would love to do a survey of teenagers and ideally to follow them over time. It's extraordinarily difficult and expensive to do so, but we're always keeping an eye out for those opportunities. We haven't done it yet. They're not on the immediate horizon, but I definitely hope someday to be able to do that. In terms of a study focused on millennials, but even more broadly about why people leave religion, I can point to a couple things. One is that most nuns were raised in a religion. The big majority of them, something like 80% of them, say they were raised in a religion, primarily Christianity. So why do they leave? Why do they become nuns? Some point to specific things. I stopped believing in my religion's teachings. My spiritual needs were not being met. The other people in my congregation were hypocrites. That's a common one. Some former Catholics cite the sex abuse scandal. So there are some nuns who point to these specific things. But the number one reason that people cite, I just gradually drifted away. It's not even a conscious decision. It's not as if there's some single precipitating event. It's a gradual process. It's a drifting away, driven presumably in part by a lack of connection or relevance or roots. And if there were something, I cannot offer advice, I cannot offer strategy, but it suggests to me that if there were something that happened during childhood, young adulthood, that made those connections firmer, more meaningful, that might prevent that sort of gradual drifting away.